Sarah Martinez was scrolling through her phone, trying to forget the disaster of a business meeting she'd just left in Chicago. Row 12, middle seat. The flight attendant's coffee breath. The businessman beside her snoring into his newspaper. Just another Tuesday evening flight home to Denver. Then, the intercom crackled with words that would transform her from anonymous passenger to the only person standing between 147 souls and catastrophe. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have a medical emergency in the cockpit. Is there anyone on board with pilot experience? Sarah's hands went cold. Her commercial pilot's license sat in her wallet, barely 6 months old. She'd logged exactly 127 hours of flight time. The captain flying this Boeing 737 had probably logged more hours in a single month than she had in her entire career. But, when the flight attendant's eyes found hers across the cabin, when she saw the desperate hope mixed with terror, Sarah knew there was no choice. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped into the most terrifying moment of her life. The turbulence hit without warning, jerking Sarah Martinez forward in her cramped middle seat. Her laptop slid across the tiny tray table, and the businessman next to her muttered something about budget airlines. Sarah pressed her face against his shoulder to peer out the small window. Below them, the lights of Denver sprawled like scattered diamonds against black velvet. She should have been relieved. The nightmare business meeting in Chicago was finally behind her. 3 days of PowerPoint presentations, stale conference room coffee, and watching her carefully prepared proposal get torn apart by executives who seemed more interested in their phones than her 5 years of research. The contract she'd been certain would change her consulting firm's future had evaporated in a conference room that smelled like disappointment and industrial carpet. Sarah pulled her phone from her purse and scrolled through the 17 missed calls from her business partner, Mike. She wasn't ready to face his questions. Not yet. The flight was supposed to land in 45 minutes. She'd call him from the airport, maybe grab a drink first. Maybe 2 drinks. The woman on her left was knitting something that looked like a deformed sweater, her needles clicking in a rhythm that matched the aircraft engines. The businessman on her right had folded his Wall Street Journal into a perfect rectangle and was reading the same paragraph over and over, his eyes glazed with the particular exhaustion of frequent business travel. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to calculate how much money they'd lost on the Chicago deal. The numbers made her stomach clench. 6 months of development costs. The advance payments to freelance researchers. The fancy hotel rooms and client dinners that were supposed to impress people who'd ultimately decided to go with a firm from New York. A firm with twice their experience and half their creativity. The intercom system squealed with feedback, making several passengers wince. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Williams speaking. Sarah opened her eyes. Something in the captain's voice sounded different. Not the usual smooth confidence of a veteran pilot making routine announcements about altitude and weather conditions. His words carried a tension that made the hair on her arms stand up. We're currently experiencing some technical difficulties in the cockpit. Nothing that affects the safety of the aircraft, but I need to ask if there are any licensed pilots among our passengers today. The cabin went completely silent. Even the knitting needles stopped clicking. Sarah felt her heart start to pound against her ribs. If you hold a current pilot's license, please press your call button and a flight attendant will speak with you immediately. Sarah's hand moved instinctively toward the small leather wallet in her purse. Inside, nestled between her driver's license and credit cards, was her commercial pilot's license. The ink was so fresh it might as well have been printed yesterday. 6 months and 12 days since she'd passed her check ride with an examiner who'd made her demonstrate every possible emergency procedure twice. She'd gotten her license on a whim. Well, not exactly a whim. More like a quarter-life crisis disguised as a practical skill. After her divorce, when the consulting business was struggling and she was spending too many nights alone in her Denver apartment, she'd decided she needed something completely different. Something that would prove to herself that she could master something difficult and beautiful and terrifying. Flying had been all 3. But 127 hours of logged flight time felt microscopic compared to the thousands of hours the captain of this commercial airliner must have. She'd never flown anything larger than a four-seat Cessna. Never navigated through commercial air traffic or dealt with the complex systems of a jet aircraft. The businessman beside her shifted in his seat, and Sarah noticed his hands were shaking slightly as he turned the page of his newspaper. The knitting woman had put down her needles and was staring straight ahead with the expression of someone trying very hard not to panic. "I repeat," the captain's voice came through the speakers again, and this time Sarah could hear something that might have been desperation beneath the professional calm. "If there are any licensed pilots on board, please identify yourselves to the flight crew immediately." Sarah looked around the cabin. Nobody was reaching for their call button. The flight attendants were walking up and down the aisles, their trained smiles looking increasingly strained. One of them, a young man with perfectly styled hair, was scanning the passengers with the intensity of someone looking for a life preserver on a sinking ship. Her commercial license qualified her to fly aircraft like this one. Technically. In perfect weather conditions, with a fully functioning aircraft, and, ideally with an instructor sitting beside her talking her through every step. But, it was a license. An actual, legal, Federal Aviation Administration approved license that said Sarah Martinez was qualified to operate commercial aircraft. She thought about Mike, probably sitting in their shared office space right now, going through the numbers from the failed Chicago presentation. She thought about her empty apartment, her car payment, her student loans from the MBA program that was supposed to guarantee her success. She thought about her ex-husband's smug voice saying she'd never stick with anything long enough to be good at it. The flight attendant with the perfect hair was 3 rows away now, moving closer. His eyes met hers for just a moment, and she saw something that made her stomach drop. Fear. Real, unfiltered fear that professional training couldn't quite hide. Sarah's finger hovered over the call button. She'd spent 6 months learning every system of aircraft like this one. Radio navigation, instrument landing procedures, emergency protocols. She'd practiced engine failures, electrical problems, hydraulic malfunctions. Her instructor, a former airline pilot named Dave, had drilled her on every possible scenario until she could handle most emergencies in her sleep. But, this wasn't a practice scenario in a flight simulator. This was a Boeing 737 at 35,000 feet with 147 people on board, and something was wrong in the cockpit. Something serious enough that a veteran airline captain was asking passengers for help. The businessman folded his newspaper with sharp, angry movements. "What kind of airline is this?" he muttered to nobody in particular. "Technical difficulties. They probably mean the autopilot stopped working and the captain doesn't know how to fly the plane himself." Sarah almost laughed. If only it were that simple. The flight attendant was 2 rows away now. His name tag said Marcus and he was probably 25 years old, maybe younger. She could see him taking deep breaths between interactions with passengers, the way her flight instructor had taught her to manage stress during emergencies. "Breathe, think, act," Dave used to say. In that order. Always in that order. Sarah took a deep breath and pressed the call button. The soft chime seemed louder than it should have been. Marcus looked up immediately, relief flooding across his face as he hurried toward her row. "Ma'am?" His voice was steady, professional, but she could see hope flickering in his eyes. "I have a commercial pilot's license," Sarah said quietly, aware that the passengers around her were suddenly paying very close attention. Marcus leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Current license?" "6 months old. But I've never flown anything larger than a Cessna 172. For just a moment, Marcus's professional mask slipped and she saw disappointment. Then, he straightened up, nodding. "The captain would like to speak with you immediately. Would you please come forward?" Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt with fingers that felt disconnected from her body. The businessman beside her was staring at her with something between admiration and terror. The knitting woman reached out and touched her arm gently. "Good luck, dear," she whispered. Following Marcus toward the front of the aircraft, Sarah felt every eye in the cabin tracking her movement. The usual sounds of commercial flight conversation, crying babies, overhead compartments rattling, had disappeared into an unnatural silence. Even the engine seemed quieter, though she knew that was impossible. At the cockpit door, Marcus knocked in what sounded like a coded pattern. The door opened immediately, revealing a flight attendant Sarah didn't recognize, an older woman with silver hair and the kind of calm competence that comes from decades of dealing with emergencies. "She's our pilot," Marcus said simply. The woman stepped aside, and Sarah got her first look into the cockpit of a commercial airliner in flight. Captain Williams was slumped forward in his seat, unconscious but breathing. His face was gray pale, and there was a small pool of vomit on the floor beside his chair. The first officer, a young woman who looked barely old enough to drive a car, was gripping the controls with white knuckles. "Thank God," the first officer said without looking back. "I'm Jessica Chen. First year with the airline. This is only my 15th flight as first officer, and Captain Williams collapsed about 3 minutes ago." Sarah stepped into the cockpit, and the door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded remarkably final. The instrument panel stretched out before her like a wall of lights, switches, and digital displays. Some of it looked familiar from retraining aircraft. Most of it looked like the control room of a space shuttle. "What's his condition?" Sarah asked, nodding toward the captain. "Conscious but disoriented," Jessica said. "He was talking normally, then, suddenly, said he felt dizzy and went down. He's breathing fine, pulse is steady, but he can't focus his eyes and he's not responding to questions coherently." Sarah moved closer to look at Captain Williams. His eyes were open but unfocused, and when she spoke his name, he looked in her direction without seeming to see her. "Possible stroke," Sarah said. "Or severe medication reaction. Either way, he's not flying this airplane." Jessica's laugh had a hysterical edge. "Neither am I. I can keep us straight and level, but I've never done an approach and landing without supervision. Never dealt with Denver's air traffic control. Never managed a medical emergency." Her voice was climbing toward panic. "I've got 43 hours in this aircraft type, and 30 of those were with an instructor." Sarah looked at the instruments. Altitude 34,000 feet. Airspeed 420 knots. Heading 240 degrees. Everything looked normal except for the flashing amber light on a panel she didn't immediately recognize. "What's that warning light?" "Hydraulic pressure dropping in System A," Jessica said. "Started about 5 minutes ago. Captain Williams was working on it when he collapsed." Sarah felt her mouth go dry. She'd practiced hydraulic failures in the simulator, but never in actual flight. And never in a commercial aircraft with this much complexity. "How much time until we reach Denver?" 38 minutes to initial approach. "But, with the hydraulic problem, we might need to declare an emergency and get priority handling." Sarah slid into the captain's seat, careful not to disturb him more than necessary. The controls felt massive compared to the small aircraft she was used to flying. Everything was bigger, heavier, more complex. But the basic principles were the same. Lift, thrust, drag, weight. The 4 forces that governed all flight. She reached for the radio microphone. "Denver approach, United 447 requesting priority handling. We have a medical emergency in the cockpit and are operating with reduced crew." The response came immediately, professional and calm. "United 447, Denver approach. Understand medical emergency. State nature of assistance required." Sarah looked at Jessica, who was staring at her with a mixture of hope and terror. "Denver approach, United 447 has an incapacitated captain and a first officer with limited experience. We also have a developing hydraulic problem. Requesting emergency equipment standing by and priority approach to the longest available runway." United 447, roger. Emergency equipment will be standing by. Cleared direct to Denver, maintain flight level 340. Expect vectors for ILS approach runway 16 are in approximately 30 minutes. Sarah hung up the microphone and turned to Jessica. "Okay. We've got 30 minutes to figure this out. Walk me through the hydraulic system." As Jessica began explaining the backup systems and emergency procedures, Sarah felt something unexpected settle over her. Not confidence exactly, but a kind of focused calm she remembered from her most challenging training flights. The fear was still there, sharp and cold in her stomach. But, alongside it was something else. She was exactly where she needed to be. The next 30 minutes would determine whether 147 people made it home safely tonight. And, for the first time since leaving Chicago, Sarah Martinez had a job that actually mattered. Sarah's hands found their rhythm on the Boeing 737's controls faster than she'd expected. The yoke felt different from the small Cessnas she'd trained on, heavier, more responsive, like the difference between driving a bicycle and operating a freight truck. But, the basic physics remained unchanged. Air moving over wings created lift. Thrust pushed them forward. Control surfaces changed their direction. System A hydraulics are down to 15%, Jessica reported, her voice steadier now that someone else was making the decisions. System B is holding at normal pressure, but if we lose that too, we'll be looking at manual reversion for all flight controls. Sarah nodded, running through her memory of emergency procedures. Manual reversion meant no power assistance for the controls. Flying this aircraft would become like wrestling with a giant that didn't want to cooperate. Possible, but exhausting and dangerous. What's our fuel status? 18,000 pounds. More than enough for a normal approach, but if we have to go around or circle for vectors, it could get interesting. Behind them, Captain Williams stirred and mumbled something unintelligible. Sarah glanced back to see him trying to sit up, his movements uncoordinated and confused. "Captain Williams, can you hear me?" she asked. "This is Sarah Martinez. I'm a licensed pilot and I'm helping Jessica fly the aircraft." Williams turned toward her voice, but his eyes couldn't seem to focus. "Sarah? Who's Sarah? Where's my first officer?" "I'm right here, Captain," Jessica said. "We're about 25 minutes from Denver. You had a medical episode and we're getting you help." Williams tried to reach for the controls, but his hand missed the yoke entirely. "I need to, the hydraulics, we were working on the hydraulics." Sarah gently moved his arm away from the instrument panel. "The hydraulics are under control, Captain. We need you to stay still and let us handle the approach." The radio crackled with Denver approach control. "United 447, descend and maintain flight level 240. Turn right heading 180 for vectors to the ILS-16 our approach." Sarah acknowledged the instructions and began the descent, watching the altimeter unwind from 34,000 feet. The aircraft responded normally, but she could feel a subtle difference in the control forces. The hydraulic problem was affecting the flight characteristics in ways that her limited experience hadn't prepared her for. "Jessica, I need you to walk me through the approach briefing for runway 16R. I've never landed at Denver International." Jessica pulled out the approach chart, spreading it between them on the center console. Runway 16R is 12,000 feet long, ILS approach with a 3-degree glide slope. Minimum decision altitude is 5,760 feet above sea level. The airport elevation is 5,431 feet, so we'll be landing more than a mile above sea level. Sarah felt her stomach clench. High-altitude operations were something she'd studied but never practiced. The thinner air at Denver's elevation would affect their approach speed, landing distance, and engine performance. Every calculation she'd memorized would need adjustment. "What's our approach speed going to be?" "With our current weight, about 138 knots. But, with the hydraulic problem, we might want to carry a few extra knots for better control authority." Sarah nodded, making mental notes. 140 knots on final approach. Flaps 30 configuration for landing. Auto brake set to maximum for the shorter stopping distance at high altitude. The flight attendant with the silver hair appeared in the cockpit doorway. "How's our patient?" Captain Williams was sitting upright now, but his color remained gray and his movements were slow and uncertain. "I think I'm okay," he said. "Just felt dizzy for a moment. Maybe I can take back the controls." Sarah and Jessica exchanged glances. Williams was clearly in no condition to fly, but convincing him of that without causing additional stress would require delicate handling. "Captain, you've been unconscious for nearly 15 minutes, Sarah said gently. "Federal regulations require that you be medically cleared before resuming flight duties. We're going to get you to a hospital as soon as we land." Williams started to protest, but another wave of dizziness seemed to wash over him and he slumped back in his seat. United 447, Denver approach. Turn left heading 120, descend and maintain 12,000 feet. You're being vectored for the ILS-16 our approach. Emergency equipment is standing by. Sarah acknowledged the clearance and continued the descent. At 18,000 feet, she noticed the first signs of the high-altitude environment. The engines were working harder to maintain the same power settings, and the aircraft felt slightly less responsive in the thinner air. System A hydraulics just dropped to 8%, Jessica reported. We're probably going to lose it completely before we land. Sarah felt sweat forming on her forehead despite the cool cockpit air. With only one hydraulic system, the aircraft would be much more difficult to control during the critical final approach phase. The margin for error was shrinking with every passing minute. "Let's review the single hydraulic system approach procedure," she said. Jessica pulled out the emergency checklist and began reading the steps aloud. Higher approach speeds for better control response. Earlier configuration to avoid rapid changes close to the ground. Manual reversion procedures if the remaining hydraulic system failed. At 15,000 feet, Denver International Airport came into view ahead of them. The massive complex stretched across the plains east of the city, its distinctive white tent-like terminal roof gleaming in the afternoon sun. Sarah could see the parallel runways laid out like enormous concrete strips, and tiny vehicles moving around the airport perimeter. United 447, turn right heading 160, descend and maintain 8,000 feet. Contact Denver Tower on 118.3 when established on the localizer. Sarah switched radio frequencies and checked in with Denver Tower. The controller's voice was calm and professional, but she could hear the underlying tension. Emergency approaches always raised the stress level for everyone involved. United 447, Denver Tower. Runway 16R, winds 180 at 12 knots. Emergency equipment is in position. You're cleared ILS-16 our approach. Cleared ILS-16 our approach, United 447, Sarah replied. She turned the aircraft to intercept the localizer beam that would guide them down to the runway. The instrument landing system was something she'd practiced hundreds of times in smaller aircraft, but never in conditions like these. Never with a failed hydraulic system and an unconscious captain and 147 passengers depending on her decisions. "Localizer alive," Jessica reported as the navigation needle began moving toward center. "We're about 8 miles from the hour marker." Sarah began configuring the aircraft for approach. Flaps 5, then flaps 15, feeling the aircraft slow and become more stable in the approach configuration. The hydraulic problem was becoming more noticeable now, requiring more control input to maintain precise flight path. "System A hydraulics are gone," Jessica announced. "Zero pressure. We're on System B only." Sarah felt the control forces increase immediately. The aircraft was still manageable, but every input required more effort. Like power steering failing in a car, but at 140 knots and 6,000 feet above the ground. "United 447, you're looking good on the approach. Emergency vehicles are standing by. Wind now 190 at 15 knots, gusting to 22. The increased wind meant more turbulence on final approach, making precise control even more challenging with the degraded hydraulic system. Sarah adjusted her technique, using larger control inputs and accepting small deviations rather than chasing perfect precision. "Outer marker inbound," Jessica called out. "Landing gear down, flaps 30. Sarah lowered the landing gear and extended the flaps to their landing position. The aircraft shuddered slightly as the gear doors opened, and she felt the increased drag trying to pull them below the glide path. 5 miles from touchdown, Jessica reported. Speed 142 knots, on glide path, on localizer. Captain Williams stirred again, looking around the cockpit with confusion. Where are we? Are we landing? We're on final approach to Denver, Captain, Sarah said without taking her eyes off the instruments. Everything's under control. Williams tried to focus on the instrument panel, but his movements were still unsteady. The hydraulics. I remember something about hydraulics. Already handled, Captain. Just rest. At 3 miles from touchdown, Sarah could see the runway clearly ahead of them. The massive concrete strip looked reassuringly wide and long, with emergency vehicles positioned along both sides. Red and white fire trucks, ambulances, airport operations vehicles, all waiting for their arrival. 2 miles out, Jessica called. Speed 141 knots, slightly right of centerline. Sarah made a small correction to bring the aircraft back to the runway centerline. The crosswind was pushing them off course, and, with the reduced hydraulic authority, she needed to make larger control inputs to maintain track. United 447, looking good. Wind 200 at 18 knots, gusting to 25. You're cleared to land runway 16R. Cleared to land, United 447. 1 mile from touchdown. Sarah could see individual people standing near the emergency vehicles, could make out the runway markings and approach lights. Everything looked normal except for the small army of emergency responders waiting for their arrival. 500 feet above minimums, Jessica called out. Speed 140 knots, on glide path. Sarah's training kicked into automatic mode. Scan the instruments, monitor the flight path, prepare for landing. The aircraft was stable and under control despite the hydraulic problem. They were going to make it. 100 feet. 50 feet. 40, 30, 20. Sarah began the landing flare, pulling back gently on the yoke to arrest their descent rate. The aircraft floated for a moment in the ground effect, then settled onto the runway with a firm but controlled touchdown. Down and stopped, Jessica announced as Sarah applied maximum braking. The aircraft decelerated quickly, the long runway providing plenty of room to stop safely. Sarah could see the emergency vehicles beginning to move alongside them as they slowed. United 447, nice job, the tower controller said. Exit at taxiway Delta when able. Emergency vehicles will escort you to the gate. Sarah finally allowed herself to breathe as the aircraft came to a complete stop. They'd made it. 147 passengers and 3 crew members were safe on the ground at Denver International Airport. Captain Williams was fully conscious now, looking around with clearer eyes. Did we land? How long was I out? About 45 minutes, Jessica said. Sarah brought us home. As the emergency medical team boarded the aircraft to evaluate Captain Williams, Sarah realized she was shaking. The adrenaline that had kept her focused during the emergency was wearing off, leaving her feeling suddenly exhausted and overwhelmed. But they were down safely. That was all that mattered. The hardest part was over. Or so she thought. The silence in the cockpit after engine shutdown felt heavier than the chaos of the emergency approach. Sarah sat in the captain's seat, her hands still gripping the yoke, watching paramedics work around Captain Williams. His color had improved, and he was speaking coherently to the medical team, but the oxygen mask over his face reminded everyone how close they'd come to a very different outcome. Ma'am? One of the paramedics, a young woman with kind eyes and confident hands, turned to Sarah. Are you experiencing any symptoms? Chest pain, dizziness, shortness of breath? Sarah shook her head, then immediately wondered if that was entirely true. Her heart was still pounding, and her hands had a subtle tremor that she hoped nobody else could see. I'm fine. Just tired. That's normal after what you've been through. We'll want to check your vitals anyway, just as a precaution. As the medical team prepared to transport Captain Williams to the hospital, he reached out and grabbed Sarah's hand with surprising strength. Thank you, he said through the oxygen mask. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been on board. Sarah squeezed his hand gently. You would have done the same thing. Williams managed a weak smile. Maybe. But I wouldn't have done it better. After the medical team left with the captain, Sarah found herself alone in the cockpit with Jessica. The first officer was slumped in her seat, staring out the windscreen at the emergency vehicles that were beginning to disperse. "I've never been so scared in my life," Jessica said quietly. "When the captain collapsed, I thought we were all going to die. I had no idea what to do." "But you kept us flying straight and level," Sarah replied. "You communicated with air traffic control, you ran through the emergency checklists. You did exactly what you needed to do." Jessica turned to look at her. "How did you stay so calm? You've never flown a commercial aircraft before today, but you acted like you'd been doing this for years." Sarah considered the question. The truth was, she hadn't felt calm at all. Every moment from the initial emergency call to touchdown had been filled with doubt, fear, and the constant worry that she was in over her head. But, somehow, the fear had sharpened her focus rather than paralyzing her. "I think when you know people are depending on you, you find reserves you didn't know you had," she said finally. A knock on the cockpit door interrupted their conversation. The flight attendant with the silver hair poked her head in. "Sarah? There are some people here who'd like to speak with you." Sarah followed her out of the cockpit and into the passenger cabin. Most of the travelers had already deplaned, but several dozen were still on board, along with what looked like an army of officials. She recognized the uniforms of airport security, FAA investigators, airline management, and local police. But it was the passengers who caught her attention first. They were standing in the aisles and looking at her with expressions she'd never seen before. Gratitude, certainly. But something deeper than that. The look of people who had faced their own mortality and lived to tell about it. The businessman who had been sitting next to her in row 12 stepped forward. His earlier irritation had been replaced by something that looked like wonder. "I wanted to thank you," he said simply. "I have 2 kids at home. Because of what you did today, I get to see them tonight." The woman who had been knitting put down her needles and stood up. "You saved our lives, dear. All of us. I don't know how to thank you for that." One by one, other passengers approached her. A young mother traveling with twin toddlers. An elderly man returning from his grandson's wedding. A college student heading home for spring break. Each had their own story, their own reason for being grateful to be alive. Sarah felt overwhelmed by their words. She'd been focused so intently on the technical aspects of flying the aircraft that she'd almost forgotten about the human dimension of what had happened. These weren't just passenger numbers or weight calculations. They were people with families, dreams, responsibilities, and fears. "I was just doing what needed to be done," she said, but even as she spoke the words, she realized how inadequate they sounded. A man in a crisp airline uniform approached. His name tag identified him as Regional Director of Operations for the airline. "Ms. Martinez, I'm David Chen. I want to personally thank you for your actions today. What you did was extraordinary, and I want you to know that the airline will be recommending you for recognition from the FAA." Sarah nodded politely, though the idea of official recognition felt strange. "How is Captain Williams?" "Initial reports from the hospital are encouraging. They think he had a severe reaction to a new blood pressure medication. He should make a full recovery." That was a relief. The guilt of having to take over someone else's aircraft would have been much harder to bear if Williams had suffered permanent harm. "We'll need you to come with us for debriefing," Chen continued. "The FAA investigators want to go through everything that happened, step by step. It's standard procedure for any incident like this." Sarah spent the next 4 hours in a conference room at Denver International Airport, walking through every detail of the flight with investigators from the Federal Aviation Administration, the National Transportation Safety Board, and the Airline Safety Department. They wanted to know about her training, her experience level, her decision-making process during the emergency, and her assessment of the aircraft's systems and performance. The investigators were thorough but respectful, clearly impressed by how she'd handled the situation. One of them, a veteran FAA inspector named Robert Hayes, told her it was one of the most professional emergency responses he'd seen from a pilot at any experience level. "You made textbook decisions throughout the entire event," he said. "Your crew resource management, your communication with air traffic control, your handling of the hydraulic problem, everything was by the book. Where did you receive your training?" Sarah told him about her flight school in Denver, about her instructor Dave, about the hundreds of hours she'd spent practicing emergency procedures in simulators and training aircraft. "Dave Martinez," Hayes said, making a note. "Is he related to you?" "No relation. Just coincidence." "Well, he obviously did an excellent job preparing you. You should be proud of what you accomplished today." As the debriefing session concluded, Sarah felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. The technical analysis had helped her process what had happened, breaking it down into manageable pieces that she could understand and learn from. But the emotional weight of the experience was something else entirely. By the time she finally left the airport, it was nearly midnight. The terminal was mostly empty except for cleaning crews and a few late-night travelers. Sarah walked through the long concourses, past the shops and restaurants that had closed hours earlier, thinking about everything that had changed in the span of a single afternoon. This morning, she'd been Sarah Martinez, struggling consultant with a failed business proposal and an uncertain future. Tonight, she was Sarah Martinez, the woman who had saved 147 lives. Her phone had been buzzing constantly with calls and messages. News outlets wanted interviews. Her business partner Mike had left 17 voicemails expressing everything from concern to amazement to business opportunities. Her family had somehow heard about the incident and were calling from across the country. But Sarah ignored all of it as she walked to her car in the long-term parking garage. She needed time to process what had happened before she could explain it to anyone else. The drive home through Denver's empty streets gave her space to think. The city looked different somehow, as if the familiar landmarks and neighborhoods belonged to a version of herself that no longer existed. The person who had driven to the airport 3 days earlier to catch a flight to Chicago felt like a stranger now. When she finally reached her apartment, Sarah poured herself a glass of wine and sat on her balcony overlooking the city lights. The mountains were invisible in the darkness, but she could feel their presence, solid and permanent against the western horizon. Her laptop sat on the kitchen table, still displaying the spreadsheet of financial projections that had seemed so important before her trip to Chicago. The failed business deal that had felt like the end of the world this morning now seemed trivial compared to what she'd experienced today. Sarah's phone rang, and she saw Dave's name on the caller ID. Her flight instructor had taught her everything she needed to know to handle the emergency, though neither of them had imagined she'd need those skills so soon. "I heard what happened," Dave said without preamble. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine. Tired, but fine." "I'm proud of you, Sarah. What you did today was remarkable. You saved a lot of lives." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes for the first time since the emergency began. "I was terrified, Dave. The whole time. I kept thinking I was going to make a mistake and kill everyone on board. But you didn't make a mistake. You did everything right. That's what training is for, so when the real emergency happens, you know what to do even when you're scared." They talked for another 20 minutes, going over the technical details of the approach and landing. Dave asked insightful questions about the hydraulic problem and praised her decision to carry extra speed on final approach. "You've got good instincts," he said. "Have you thought about making flying more than just a hobby?" The question surprised her. "What do you mean?" "The airlines are always looking for pilots with your skills and judgment. After what happened today, I think you'd have your pick of opportunities." Sarah had never seriously considered a career in aviation. Flying had been an escape, a challenge, something to prove to herself that she could master a difficult skill. But the idea of turning it into a profession was intriguing. After she hung up, Sarah sat in the darkness thinking about Dave's suggestion. The consulting business that had consumed her life for the past 5 years suddenly seemed less appealing than it had before. The politics, the endless proposals, the disappointment of deals that fell through, all of it felt small compared to the clarity and purpose she'd experienced in the cockpit today. She thought about Captain Williams, probably sleeping in a hospital bed tonight, grateful to be alive. She thought about Jessica, who would go on to become an excellent pilot with today's experience behind her. She thought about all the passengers who were home with their families because of decisions she'd made at 35,000 feet. The phone rang again. This time it was a number she didn't recognize. Ms. Martinez? This is Carol Thompson from CNN. We'd like to interview you about what happened on United Flight 447 today. Sarah politely declined and turned off her phone. Tomorrow, there would be interviews and recognition ceremonies and job offers. There would be paperwork and follow-up meetings and probably a formal investigation report to review. But tonight, Sarah Martinez sat on her balcony and marveled at the fact that sometimes life presents you with exactly the challenge you need, precisely when you're ready to meet it. She'd boarded Flight 447 as a passenger in row 12, anonymous and discouraged. She was ending the day as something she'd never expected to become, a pilot who had been tested under fire and found equal to the challenge. The city lights stretched out below her, each one representing someone who was home safely tonight partly because of what she'd done. It was a responsibility she'd never asked for, but one that had revealed capabilities she hadn't known she possessed. As she finally prepared for bed, Sarah realized that her life had been divided into two parts, before Flight 447 and after Flight 447. The woman who had worried about failed business deals and uncertain futures had been replaced by someone who knew, with absolute certainty, that she could handle whatever challenges lay ahead. The passenger in row 12 was gone forever. In her place was a pilot who had discovered her true calling 35,000 feet above the ground, in the most unlikely circumstances imaginable. And, tomorrow, Sarah Martinez would begin the process of figuring out what to do with the rest of her extraordinary life.